The last of the cattle were being herded out when the auction yard fell into a strange stillness, the kind that comes only after too much noise has burned itself out. Dust hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, catching in the throat and stinging the eyes. Men with tired faces and whiskey breath pulled at their hats as they counted what few coins they had won or lost. The smell of animals and sweat clung to the wooden rails that had been leaned against all day. A dog barked once from the far corner, then even that sound was swallowed up by silence. It was Texas in the year 1882, and autumn had pressed its hand over the land, leaving the grass brittle and the sky wide and tired. Silas Boone stood apart from the crowd, a man made of long hours and little company. His hands were rough, his boots dust-caked, and his hat pulled low to keep his eyes hidden. He had come only to look at horses, maybe to take home one if the price was fair, nothing more. Yet as he turned to leave, his gaze caught on a figure that did not belong to the fading auction. She was standing near a post, a girl no more than 19, her feet bare and gray with dust, her dress torn at the hem and clinging to her thin frame. A rope tied around her wrist marked her not as a visitor but as something left behind, a forgotten piece of trade that no one wanted. Beside her leaned a man with a bottle swinging in his hand. His laughter cracked and ugly. He spoke to no one in particular, slurring his words loud enough for all to hear. Said she was dumb, could not hear, could not speak, but she could clean and cook, and that was worth something to somebody. The few men who still lingered chuckled darkly, their teeth yellow in the fading light. One spat on the ground, another muttered about taking her home, if only for the price of the shawl on her shoulders. Silas turned his face away, for he had no wish to be part of this. His life had been built on the silence of open land, the kind of silence that did not need breaking. He was ready to walk on, but then the girl lifted her head. Her eyes found his with a steadiness that unsettled him. There was no begging in them, no plea for help, only a clear gaze that held something he recognized. It was the same emptiness he had carried inside himself for years, the same loneliness that could not be covered by fences or work. The drunk man stumbled closer, waving the rope like it was nothing more than twine tied to a stray calf. Asked if Silas had coin, said the girl could go with the horse. The men nearby laughed louder, calling out that the lonely Boone was buying himself more than livestock today. Silas did not answer them. His hand moved to the pouch at his belt, fingers brushing over coins that had been saved for feed and winter supplies. He looked once more at the girl, still and waiting, her face pale under the dust. In her eyes he saw not desperation, but something harder to name, something like understanding. The weight of the silence pressed down heavy, and in that moment Silas knew he would not leave her there. He counted the coins into the drunk man's hand, feeling each piece of silver as though it carried more than its worth. The rope was dropped, the laughter rose, but none of it mattered. The girl stepped behind him, quiet as a shadow, and when he led his horse toward the gate, she followed with soft steps that made no sound on the hard ground. The coins had already left his hand, yet Silas Boone felt the weight of them long after the drunk had staggered away with his bottle. The horse stood uneasy at the gate, her ribs sharp against her hide, but it was not the mare that troubled him most. It was the girl who followed him without a word, her steps soundless, her face hidden behind strands of hair that had not been brushed in too long. He had bought her in the same way a man bought a shovel or a saddle. At least that was what the others in town had jeered. But he knew there had been something different in the moment he chose. She had not begged him. She had not cried. She had only looked at him, and in that gaze had been something he could not name. He guided the mare toward his wagon, feeling the eyes of the remaining men burn into his back. They shouted crude remarks, called him lonely, mocked the thought of him taking a girl home like a man might bring home a mule. Silas did not answer. He had lived long enough to know that words only fed men who thrived on cruelty. The girl walked behind him, holding her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, her bare feet striking the ground with soft thuds. When they reached the wagon, Silas lifted the gate and motioned for her to climb inside. She paused, studying him, then folded herself into the corner like a bird finding a place to rest. The road out of town stretched long and flat, the kind of road that left a man alone with his thoughts. Silas held the reins loosely, guiding the mare with a hand steady from years of quiet labor. The girl sat in the back, knees pulled to her chest, her face turned toward the horizon. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with questions he could not ask and answers she could not give. The wagon creaked beneath them, the wheels cutting through hard-packed clay, carrying them further from the noise of town and deeper into the wide, waiting land. By the time the sun began to sink, the outlines of his ranch came into view. It was not much to look at, only a cabin with a slanted roof, a barn leaning against the wind, and stretches of red earth that rolled out toward the hills. It was a lonely place, but it was his, and until that day he had believed it was enough. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. For a moment he wondered if she would run, but she did not. She stepped lightly to the ground, her eyes scanning the land as though she were memorizing every fence post and stone. Inside the cabin, Silas stoked the fire and placed a kettle on the hook. The girl watched him with calm eyes. Then, without being asked, she moved to the shelf, found tin cups, and set them on the table. She moved like someone who had always belonged near fire and hunger. Silas studied her for a long moment, then turned away, unsure of what to say, unsure if words even mattered. He had made a purchase, but what he had brought home was not a servant nor a burden. It was something else, something he had yet to understand, and as the firelight flickered across her face, he felt the first shift in the silence of his life. The cabin had always been a place built for one, a square of logs against the wide sky, a roof that leaked when the rains came hard, a hearth that gave enough heat to keep a man alive through winter nights. Silas Boone had lived there for years, his boots carving the same path from door to barn, his meals eaten alone, his words spoken mostly to cattle and horses. The silence had been his companion, a constant that never pressed too close and never asked for more. Yet when he opened the door that evening and let the girl step inside, the silence seemed to change. It was no longer the emptiness of solitude. It was a quiet, filled with presence, like the air itself had taken notice. The girl moved with care, her eyes sweeping over the single room, taking in the rough table, the shelf of tin cups, the narrow bed against the wall. She did not flinch, nor did she linger in hesitation. She simply folded her hands before her, as if waiting for him to decide what came next. Silas set his hat on the peg by the door and stoked the fire with practiced ease, though he was more aware of every sound than he had ever been before. The scrape of iron, the crackle of wood, the hiss of sparks rising. She watched, her gaze steady, not curious but calm, as though she had stepped into many such cabins before, and none of them surprised her. He poured water into the kettle and hung it over the flame, then turned to find her still standing near the door. He pointed toward the bench by the table. She obeyed without question, sitting with her shawl pulled close, her posture straight despite the weariness in her shoulders. Silas sat across from her, his large hands folded on the table, unsure of what to do with them. For a long time they remained like that, two figures bound by silence, the fire painting their shadows on the log walls. When the water boiled, he poured 2 cups and pushed one toward her. She lifted it with both hands, drank slowly, and set it back without spilling a drop. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if each one carried weight. Silas found himself studying her, not in the way the men at the auction had done, but in search of something deeper, a clue to who she was and why she looked at him with such steady eyes. Later, when he laid a blanket on the floor near the hearth, she took it without protest. She spread it neatly, folded herself onto it, and closed her eyes. She made no sound, not even a sigh. Silas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the flames as they sank lower. He had thought the cabin would feel crowded with another soul inside it, but instead it felt larger, as if the walls had shifted to make room. The loneliness that had lived with him for so long did not vanish, but it eased, replaced by something he could not yet name. And as he lay back on his pillow, listening to the faint sound of her breathing near the fire, he realized the cabin meant for one no longer felt so empty. The morning broke with pale light creeping across the plains, soft and cool, the kind of light that made the world seem quieter than it already was. Silas Boone had been up before dawn, tending the mare he had brought home from the auction. The animal's ribs still showed, her legs swollen, but she had taken a little water, which gave him reason to hope. When he returned to the cabin, he found the girl already awake, kneeling by the hearth with fresh kindling arranged neatly, the fire catching in a slow curl of smoke. She moved like someone who had always belonged near work, her hands steady, her eyes calm. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. He wanted to speak, but words felt heavy in his throat. He had not spoken much in years, and now there was someone in his home who seemed to live without them altogether. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. She glanced at him, not startled, just aware. He pointed to the table where a scrap of chalk lay near the cupboard, a piece left over from when his mother had once marked measurements for curtains long gone. He picked it up and tapped it against the doorframe beside the table, the wood worn smooth by time. "Name," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He held the chalk out to her. For a long moment she did not move, her dark eyes searching his face as though weighing whether she should trust the request. Then, slowly, she rose and crossed the small room. Her fingers brushed the chalk from his hand. She crouched by the frame, tilting her head, as if listening to something he could not hear. With careful strokes she wrote, her letters slanted but graceful, the chalk squeaking lightly against the wood. Silas leaned down to read. The name appeared in pale white across the frame, a word that seemed to settle into the cabin as though it had always belonged there. "Marin," he read aloud, tasting the sound of it. He said it again, softer this time, as if the air itself needed to carry it more gently. She looked at him, her expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in her eyes that told him she had heard it, even if not with her ears. He touched the letters with his thumb, feeling the powder crumble beneath his skin. Names were a kind of truth, a way of saying that someone was more than shadow. For years his cabin had held only his own, scratched into tools and stitched into old saddlebags, but now another name rested inside its walls, delicate yet certain. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the shutters, Silas found himself repeating it in silence, letting the syllables settle in his chest. Marin lay near the hearth wrapped in her blanket, her breathing even, her face softened by sleep. He watched her for a moment before turning away, yet the name lingered like a quiet promise. His cabin, once meant for one, now carried two names, and in that small change, the world around him felt less hollow. The day had been warm and still, the kind of day that carried no hint of danger. The cattle grazed quietly near the fence line, the grass brittle beneath their hooves, while the sky above spread wide and blue, with only a thin haze near the horizon. Silas Boone had spent the afternoon mending a gate, his shirt damp with sweat, his hat pulled low against the Sunday. Marin moved about the yard with quiet steps, drawing water from the well, laying herbs to dry along the porch rail, her hair blowing loose in the faint wind. It was an ordinary day in every way, yet as evening came on, the air shifted. The wind grew warmer, rising sharp from the south, carrying a taste of iron that prickled on the tongue. Silas noticed it but thought little of it. Storms were common in that season and most passed without harm. He stayed in the cattle shed, crouched low over a sick calf, rubbing medicine into its hide. That was when he felt the tug on his sleeve. Marin stood at the doorway, her feet bare, her breath quick though she made no sound, her eyes fixed on the sky above, dark and certain. She pointed, her hand trembling, urging him out into the open. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's just a wind," he said, though he knew she could not hear. She shook her head and tugged harder, her eyes demanding that he follow. Something in her gaze, steady and unyielding, pressed against the doubt in his chest. He set the rag aside and let her lead him out into the yard. The horizon had changed. Clouds rose in a jagged line, black at the base, and lit with a strange yellow glow near the top. The air felt wrong, heavy, as though the sky itself was waiting to break. Marin kept her grip on his sleeve, pulling him away from the shed. Then it came, sudden and fierce. A crack like the world splitting apart. Lightning fell in a jagged spear, striking the old oak that leaned just behind the cattle shed. The sound shook the ground beneath their feet, the tree bursting into flame before crashing with a roar that sent cattle bellowing in terror. Silas staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. Sparks lit the air, smoke curling upward in dark columns. He turned toward Marin, and she stood there in the firelight, her face pale, her eyes unblinking. She had known. Not after the first gust, not after the thunder rolled, but before, long before, the sky gave its warning. She had pulled him from the shed seconds before the tree split the roof in two. They stood together until the fire burned low and the storm passed on, leaving only ash and char. That night, inside the cabin, they sat at the table with no chalk between them, no words at all. The silence was deep, but it was not empty. For the first time, Silas understood that Marin did not need ears to hear. She heard in a way no one else could. And in her silence he found something he had not felt in years, a sense of being seen. He looked at her across the flickering firelight and whispered her name, and though she gave no reply, he knew she had understood. The morning after the storm broke clear and cool, the kind of morning that made the land seem scrubbed clean, though the blackened stump of the oak behind the cattle shed still smoked faintly. Silas Boone saddled his horse and rode into town for salt and nails, yet his mind was restless. The storm had left him shaken, not only by the fire, but by the way Marin had known it was coming. She had looked at the sky as if she could hear its secret voice, and when he thought of the moment she pulled him from danger, a shiver passed through him that was not fear, but something deeper, a strange kind of awe. In town he met the sheriff, a man with sharp eyes who had known Silas since boyhood. They spoke of supplies, of fences, of the hard season ahead, but then the sheriff lowered his voice and mentioned old talk that still stirred among certain families. He spoke of Silas's father, of the war years when land had been claimed in ways that were not clean, of men driven off and bitterness left behind. Silas said little, only nodded, but the words sat heavy on him as he rode home. The land he worked, the house he lived in, the fences he mended, all carried a history that was not his alone. He had known this since he was young, yet the weight of it pressed harder now, as though time itself wanted to remind him of debts unpaid. When he reached the ranch, Marin was sitting on the porch rail, her dark eyes watching the hills. She rose when she saw him, her hands brushing the dust from her dress. He dismounted slowly, his shoulders tight, his face hard. He did not tell her what the sheriff had said. He did not speak at all, but when he sat on the step with his head bowed, she came to stand beside him. For a long time neither of them moved, the wind carrying only the low sound of cattle in the distance. Silas felt the shame he had carried for years press heavier than ever, the shame of a name tied to land taken in blood. He muttered aloud, though his voice was more to himself than to her, words that trembled against the silence. Shame about what my father did, shame that it lies under my boots every day. He lifted his head slightly and found Marin looking at him. She did not frown, she did not turn away. Instead she knelt beside him, lifted her small hand, and laid it against his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was light, yet it carried weight. It was steady, certain, as though she had known the storm inside him without needing to be told. She did not speak, she did not write a single word, but in that quiet moment, Silas felt something ease, a burden he had carried alone, now shared in silence. Marin rose after a while and walked toward the old oak where his father's grave rested. She stood there a long time, the wind stirring her hair, and Silas watched with a heaviness in his throat. She had never read the stone, never asked about the past, yet she seemed to know, and in that knowing he felt seen, scars and all, as if the land itself had heard him at last. The first whispers began as they often did, passed quietly across porch rails, and at the pump where women gathered with their buckets. A ranch hand's wife said she had seen the girl staring too long at a cow that later sickened, and another woman added that the child she had touched at church had fallen ill that same night. Silas Boone had lived long enough to know how quickly silence could be filled with suspicion, and in a town like theirs, different was seldom given the grace of understanding. Marin, who spoke no words and carried no sound, had already unsettled them by her quiet presence. Now, after the storm, after her calm in the face of danger, they seemed eager to shape her stillness into something unnatural. When Silas rode into town for flour and nails, he felt the weight of eyes on him. Men leaning against fence rails lowered their talk when he passed, and women turned their children aside, pulling them close as though his shadow might carry danger. He kept his jaw set, his stride steady, but each look pressed into him like a burr that would not shake free. At the store, the shopkeeper handed him his goods without a word, his eyes sliding toward the door, where Marin waited, her hands folded, her gaze low. Silas thanked him curtly and left, his chest heavy with the air of judgment that clung tighter than dust. Marin did not flinch when a woman spat near her feet, nor when a boy muttered a curse under his breath as she passed. She kept her steps even, her shoulders straight, but Silas noticed how her fingers curled tighter around the handle of the basket she carried. She did not ask why. She did not lift her eyes to meet their stares, yet he knew she felt every bit of it. On the ride home, she sat quiet in the wagon, her face turned toward the horizon, and though she gave no sign of fear, he could see the weight pressing against her silence. At night he lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, thinking of the way the town had looked at her. It was not simple dislike. It was something colder, a certainty formed from ignorance, and he knew too well how quickly such certainty could turn to cruelty. Marin moved about the cabin as though unaware, lighting the fire, setting herbs to dry, mending a tear in his coat with patient stitches. She never spoke of it, never wrote a word about the whispers, yet her quiet carried a strength that both humbled and troubled him. One afternoon, as he mended a fence near the road, he caught sight of two riders slowing their horses to peer toward his land. Their voices carried in the still air, words sharp with doubt. They spoke of curses, of animals gone lame, of storms that seemed to follow his ranch. Silas gripped the hammer in his hand until the wood dug into his palm. He wanted to shout, to drive them off, but he held his tongue, for he knew that anger would only feed their talk. He watched them ride away, the dust of their passing hanging like a cloud over the fields. Back at the cabin, Marin was kneeling by the mare, her hands moving gently along the horse's flank, her face calm, her touch steady. The animal, once skittish, stood quiet under her care, breathing evenly as though it trusted her more than it ever had trusted him. Silas stood at the doorway, his chest tight. He knew what the town chose not to see, that her silence was not a curse but a gift, and that she carried a kind of listening that went deeper than sound. Still, he also knew the whispers would grow louder, and soon they would not settle for muttered words or sidelong looks. Soon they would come with voices raised, demanding answers that had no easy truth. The night was still when the sound of boots came up the road, heavy and sure, a sound that did not belong to neighbors passing by, but to men who carried purpose. Silas Boone had been in the barn mending harness straps when he heard it, the crunch of gravel under more than one pair of heels, the low murmur of voices thick with unease. He stepped into the yard, wiping his hands on a rag, and found 8 men and women standing by his gate, their faces half hidden by the lantern glow. None carried torches lit, but several held them like they were ready, the unspoken threat hanging sharp in the cold air. At their front was Withers, an old rancher whose gray beard and stiff back gave him a kind of authority. His voice carried steady, though Silas could hear the fear beneath it. "We want her gone," Withers said, his chin jerking toward the house where Marin stood behind the curtain. "That girl hears things she ought not. She's not right." Silas folded his arms across his chest and stood in the barn doorway. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "She's mute," he answered, the word falling flat in the silence. "That ain't the same as deaf," Withers snapped, his eyes flashing. "She sees storms before they come. She touches animals, and they bend to her. She knows sickness before it shows. That ain't natural." It's cursed. A murmur rippled through the crowd, one woman clutching her shawl tighter, another man spitting into the dirt as if to rid himself of the thought. Inside, Marin did not move, her stillness a shadow behind the thin fabric of the curtain. She had heard the gravel shift beneath their boots, had seen their mouths twist with certainty, and she did not need ears to know what they carried with them. Silas stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly in the thawing mud. His face was hard from years of sun and silence, but his eyes burned steady. "She saved a child's life," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "She's the only person I've known who listens, not with ears, but with her hands, her breath, her whole soul." Withers sneered, ready to answer, but Silas cut across him, his words pressing like stone. "I have lived 35 years, and in that time I can count on one hand the number of people who have truly heard me. Not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief. She has, without speaking a single thing." His gaze swept across them, steady as the line of fence posts that marked his land. "You want to drive her off for being different? For seeing what you are too afraid to face? You'll have to go through me first." "In your face." The yard went quiet. The torches remained unlit, the lantern light flickering across uneasy faces. Withers opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw working but no words coming. Slowly, one by one, they turned, boots dragging heavy as they left the gate behind. When the last shadow had faded into the dark, Silas let out a breath he had not known he was holding. Inside, Marin stepped from the curtain, her eyes calm, though her fingers trembled slightly at her sides. He walked back into the cabin, and for a moment neither spoke, only the fire crackled. Then she reached out and laid her hand against his, not as thanks but as recognition. He curled his fingers gently around hers, and together they sat in the hush of the night, the bond between them stronger than any words could make. The days after the standoff with the townsfolk carried a new kind of quiet, not the emptiness Silas Boone had always known, but a silence full of meaning. The ranch seemed to breathe easier, though the memory of boots at the gate lingered. Marin moved about the place as she always had, tending the fire, brushing the horses, laying herbs to dry, yet something had shifted. She no longer lingered in the shadows but stood beside him more often, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering. Silas, who had always lived by unspoken rules of solitude, found himself watching her hands, the way they shaped meaning without words, the way they brushed a horse's flank or mended a tear in his shirt with quiet skill. One evening as the sun sank low and the sky burned with streaks of red, she brought him a small slate and chalk she had found in a drawer. She placed it before him on the table and tapped it gently, then made a simple gesture with her fingers, pointing to herself and then to him. Silas stared, puzzled at first, until she slowly shaped her hands again, a movement that felt like water slipping over stone. She repeated it, patient, her eyes soft but expectant. He tried to copy the motion, fumbling with his large fingers, the result clumsy and crooked. She smiled then, not with her mouth but with her eyes, and reached across the table to guide his hand, reshaping his fingers until the sign was clear. "Water," she showed him, and then fire, and then thank you. Each gesture was small, but it carried a weight deeper than words. Silas practiced late into the evening, repeating them until the shapes began to feel less foreign, less like a struggle. When he failed, she touched his hand lightly, steadying him without judgment. In return, Silas taught her the ways of the land. He showed her how to mend a saddle strap, how to set a post straight, how to ride the older mare who had once flinched from every touch, but now followed Marin's calm hand like a shadow. She had never sat a saddle before, yet she moved with the animal as if she understood its rhythm through her bones. Silas walked beside her, speaking in low tones though he knew she could not hear, telling her about the hills, the seasons, the way the land changed under different skies. She glanced down at him once, her dark hair whipping in the wind, and though she gave no reply, her face carried a look of understanding that made him quiet. Nights grew softer. They sat by the fire, her fingers tracing shapes in the air while he tried to follow, his rough hands clumsy but eager. He learned slowly, Yet she never lost patience, and in her silence he discovered a peace he had never known. One night, after many tries, he managed to shape a sentence, shaky but true. "You make this place full." She stilled, then touched her fingers gently to his lips. Not a kiss, only a way of saying she heard him. And in that moment Silas knew the language they were building was not made of sound, but of hearts willing to listen. Winter crept slow across the plains, laying frost over the grass and pressing a hush into the mornings. The townsfolk still whispered, but the edge of their suspicion began to dull. It started with a feverish child, a ranch hand's boy who had burned with heat and shaken with chills through a long night. The doctor was away east, and his mother, desperate and weeping, came riding hard to Silas Boone's gate. She begged for help, not from Silas, but from Marin. Without a word, Marin followed her, carrying only a pouch of herbs and a cloth. She knelt by the child's cot, her hands steady as she cooled his brow and brewed a bitter drink. By sunrise, the boy was sitting up, weak but smiling, and his mother clung to Marin's hand with tears of thanks. The story spread fast, and though some twisted it into unease, more began to wonder. A week later, a man with a lame horse came, his eyes hard with doubt, but his hope stronger. Marin walked into the stable, pressed her palm along the horse's flank, and mixed a poultice of pine and sage. By the week's end, the horse was back on its feet. Another woman came after, sleepless from grief, and Marin sat with her through the night, resting a hand on her shoulder until the shaking stilled. Slowly, the visits became more frequent, quiet at first, as if people were ashamed to be seen asking her for help, but they came all the same. Silas watched it all, with a kind of pride he did not speak aloud. He saw the way the town's eyes began to soften, the way some men tipped their hats when passing her at the store, the way women began to offer jars of preserves or bolts of cloth in return for her kindness. There were still those who crossed the street or muttered about curses, but their voices grew weaker, drowned by gratitude that spread with each life she touched. In the evenings, Silas and Marin sat by the fire, their hands moving slowly through signs, the new language growing easier between them. He told her she had turned suspicion into something better, though he doubted she needed to be told. She never claimed pride, never sought thanks. She only met each day with the same quiet patience. One Sunday morning, the church bell rang and its echo rolled out over the fields. Panic followed soon after. A 7-year-old boy had vanished during chores, his boot found near the tree line, no other sign of him. Men shouted, dogs barked, mothers wept. Silas reached for his coat, but Marin was already beside him. She knelt in the dirt, pressed her palms to the ground, her eyes closed as if listening. Then she rose and pointed west, her face certain. They followed her without question, through thickets and dry creek beds, until in a cedar clearing they found the boy, frightened but alive. When they returned, no one called her cursed. They called her the girl who listens with her heart. The word spread with the wind, soft yet sure, and for the first time, fear in the town gave way to something far stronger, the beginnings of faith. The years slipped by quiet as dust on the wind, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt as steady as the turning seasons. Winters came with their sharp bite, and Silas Boone rose before dawn to keep the fire fed, always finding Marin already awake, her hands busy with small tasks that made the cabin warmer than it had ever been before. Summers spread wide and hot across the plains, and together they worked the land, their shadows side by side in the fields. Where once the silence had pressed heavy on Silas, now it was filled with her presence, her calm ways, her smile that came rare but true, and it made him wonder how he had ever thought the ranch was enough on its own. The townsfolk who once turned from her had slowly turned back, drawn not by fear now, but by quiet gratitude. They came first in whispers, a man with a lame horse, a mother with a child who could not sleep, and later more openly, with hats tipped and gifts of preserves left at the gate. Marin met them all with the same patience, never asking, never judging, only offering her steady touch and her unspoken listening. Soon, children began to gather at the ranch, their laughter filling the yard where once only the creak of wind had lived. They followed her through the garden, into the stable, across the fields, learning to read the land in the silence she taught best. Silas often watched from the porch, arms crossed, his chest heavy with something he had not known for most of his life. Pride, not the kind that boasted, but the kind that comes when a man sees the world made better by someone he loves. At dusk, when the last of the children had gone, he and Marin would sit on the bench beneath the cottonwood tree. Sometimes he brought out his harmonica and played a tune that had no name, and though she could not hear it, she swayed gently, her eyes closed, as if she felt every note. Other nights they spoke with their hands, his fingers slow and clumsy, hers graceful and patient, building small sentences that carried more weight than whole pages of words. One evening she surprised him, her voice breaking the hush of twilight, soft and careful, yet clear enough to carry. "I do not need sound," she said, her lips trembling into the shape of words. "Only you." Silas blinked, his throat tight, and reached for her hand. "I hear you," he answered, his voice rough with feeling. "I always have." She smiled then, and it felt to him like sunrise, a light breaking across the years of silence they had both carried. They grew older, their steps slower, their hair touched with silver, but the bond between them did not fade. Neighbors still called Silas the lonely rancher, but now the words carried a smile, for everyone knew he was lonely no more. He had found what he had never spoken of, love that needed no words, only two hearts willing to listen. If you have walked with Silas and Marin through their journey and felt the quiet strength of their love, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends, and do not forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. Out here on the plains, even silence tells a story, but it sure helps when someone clicks the bell too.